I think if I was going to write something about Vincent Price, if I was searching for a title, I would come up with the Everybody Loves Vincent. Because everyone did love Vincent, not only because he was a nice guy and had great skill as an actor, he was somebody who reinvented himself. He was someone, as we will learn tonight even more, that had many, many more interests than just acting. And it is my privilege to introduce our special guest tonight, who proves the cliche, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, is alive and well. She is a writer, author, teacher, art expert. I could go on, but I am really honored to have her here today. So please give a warm Palm Springs welcome to Miss Victoria Price. When you came along, your dad's career was well on its way. He had already been in the Roger Corman film and The Pit and the Pendulum and all of that. Was there a lot of acting talk or talk about his profession and his social circle, or did it focus more on his other interests?
You know, at home, he really talked more about his other interests. I was born in the early 60s, and that was the time during which he sold art for Sears Roebuck. Which sounds ridiculous, I know, but Sears was actually revamping their image, so they were hiring spokespeople. And they hired people like Ted Williams to be their spokesman for, sporting goods, and Sir Edmund Hillary for camping and outdoor gear. And they thought to hire my dad, who was equally well known at that point as an actor, as an art expert, because he'd done a show called the $64,000 Challenge. And so they asked him if he wanted to be the spokesman for the art at Sears. And my dad took one look at the art being sold at Sears. He said, no way. But my mother, who was always about 5 years ahead of the curve, said, well, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is Sears Roebuck, for goodness sake, and if you could do anything for Sears with art, what would it be? He said, well, if they'd let me buy all the art. And she said, why don't you ask them? So he did, and he ended up buying tens of thousands of pieces of art for Sears. My mother framed almost every piece in our basement, and you could go into Sears, all over the country and buy like a Picasso, a Vuillard, an emerging artist on your Sears credit card with a money-back guarantee.
We've gone from the Vincent Price collection to YouTube videos. I think the culture is not going in the right direction.
But so that was really, there would be art spread out all over the living room floor with inventories, and that was really what I saw and what his passion was as far as I was concerned. And I didn't see him act very much at all. I was taken to see him act in Peter Pan, and I freaked out so loudly the moment I saw him have a hook that they never took me to see him at anything. My poor mother was so mortified.
Oh my God. Now your dad was more, one of the stories is that in the 40s, I believe, he and the actor George McCready opened their own gallery for a time on Sunset. But, a lot of people say, Vincent Price was an art collector, which he certainly was. But he was a student. This was someone who graduated from Yale. Her dad was a Yale man, and then I believe he studied in England. This was more than a passion or a hobby. He was learned.
He was getting his master's degree, and somebody dared him to try out for a play because he was such a theater buff and had always had this sort of pipe dream of becoming an actor. And he auditioned for a play, got a bit part, and then the next play he auditioned for was such a huge success that he was named Male Newcomer of the Year in the British Theatre. And the female newcomer of the year that year was Vivian Leigh. So then the play was bought as a piece for Helen Hayes, and he was brought over to star opposite Helen Hayes, and that's how he became an actor. But he had bought his first piece of art when he was 12 years old. He walked by a gallery, fell in love with this piece of art. It was a first state Rembrandt etching. And he went in and asked the gallery owner how much it was. The man told him $37.50 in 1924. And of course, he was a kid, so he had to earn the money with his allowance and odd jobs. It took him 3 years to buy that Rembrandt. Wow. And he bought his last piece of art when he was, 2 weeks before he died. But in between, he bought, that was his great passion, but he also started a museum in East Los Angeles. Where
I have been there, the Vincent Art Museum in East LA.
But yeah, no, it was his absolute passion, and he was on the boards of the original board of LA County, the UCLA Arts Council, and boards of museums all over the country. It was his absolute passion to promote the visual arts in this country, and that's really what I grew up learning about.
All right. Now, his circle of friends, I know he was very close to Roddy McDowell and whatever. What was the Vincent Price social world Hollywood life like? Because, you know, there's a couple people in my personal pantheon where if there was a time machine, who would you like to go back and have dinner with? You know, like Charles McGraw, I would go back and have a beer with.
Right.
But your dad would be one of the people I would just love to sit and have dinner with and just listen to him and hear him converse. What was his social life like when you remember?
Well, they threw these amazing parties. My mother was a costume designer, actually. She was a costume designer on Broadway, and then that's how she and my dad met. She designed the costumes for a movie he was in. And they would throw these dinner parties, and for my mother, it was like a Broadway show. So one time she actually copper glazed an entire set of dishes for a dinner party in her own walk-in kiln. She was like Martha Stewart, 30 years before Martha Stewart. And they would have, orchestras for New Year's Eve, and their circle of friends, though, was very much a circle of interesting people that they could talk to. There would be people who would float in and out who were, hugely famous, but really their circle of friends, their closest friends were people like Eddie Albert and Margot Albert, Frank McCarthy, who produced the movie Patton, and his partner Rupert Allen, who was the publicist for Grace Kelly, Bill Bryce, who was Fanny Bryce's son and an incredible abstract expressionist artist, and his wife. They were people who were really dear friends that they could talk deeply with about interesting things. And then people would float through or be befriended. And my dad was always befriending young artists, people who wanted to be artists. And one of those was a man who at 16 years old my dad met, and he went on to have a very nice career. His name was Dennis Hopper. And so my dad met Dennis when he was about 16, and Dennis wanted to know everything about art, so my dad would invite him over for dinner parties if someone interesting was coming, like Max Beckmann, the German artist, came to dinner, and my dad was I think Dennis was 18, and he was invited to that dinner. Wow. And so one of the big reasons Dennis became an art collector and an artist as much as an actor was because of my dad. So my dad's circle of friends really were people, certainly there were very famous people he knew, but really he was much more interested in having a great conversation. Yeah,
I mean, your dad, I made that remark, everybody loves Vincent, but your dad was someone who, in my opinion, relished life, and he also went out of his way to get people to like him. I mean, he liked people and so on, and I remember either reading or being told a story that, one fellow he couldn't reach that he was with in House of Wax was Charles Bronson. Yeah. And he said, I can't understand why he won't let me be friends with him. Yes. Was he someone that just really reveled in living?
He did, and he actually genuinely loved people. I remember one time my brother and I were having lunch with him in a tiny little town in New Mexico, and this guy came up to him and he said, "Oh, you probably don't remember me, Mr. Price. I was, the assistant to the cameraman on this TV show," and I looked at my brother and I thought, oh my God, he's never going to remember. And he said, "Oh, Bob, it's so great to see you. How's your wife Sally and your dog?" I mean, I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. And my dad remembered this guy. I mean, he really loved people. It was a genuine thing. Yeah. He used to say that the song he wanted sung at his funeral was from Funny Girl, "People who need people are the luckiest people in the world." That's how he felt.
That's nice. That's nice. I mean, I told you this story where I was in a video store years ago, and there were these people laughing and talking, so I kind of wanted to hear what that, and they were talking about your dad, and this old fellow was there. He was the camera operator for House on Haunted Hill with Vincent Price, and of course they were talking about your dad, and they said that they did a take with the end where the girl shoots him, and William Castle said, "Cut. Vincent, the script says you're supposed to fall backwards when she shoots you," and he said, "My dear boy, no actor worth his salt falls out of the frame of a shot. I will fall forward." And I mean, you really had to love somebody that loved life. Now, his acting career, as I mentioned, you talked about at the stage, then he came to Hollywood. How did he make the transition from the stage into Hollywood?
It's actually a great story. So he, when he came to Broadway, it was 1935, and he was opposite Helen Hayes in the hit play on Broadway. It was called Victoria Regina, and he was offered $1 million movie contract because he was the hot young star.
Mm-hmm.
And he had the humility at 24 years old to go and ask Miss Hayes her advice. And she just said one thing to him. She said, "Do you feel that you know your craft?" And my dad looked at her and he said, "Well, how can I know my craft? I've been in like a play and a half." And she said, "Exactly. If you don't want to be a flash in the pan, turn down the $1 million movie contract and learn your craft." So in those days, Broadway closed in the summer because there were no air conditioning in the theaters. And so he would do summer stock, and the people in summer stock were amazing, and they were great plays, and he did that for 2 years, did Victoria Regina for 2 years, and then Universal put him under contract, and the first movie they had him do was a sort of this screwball comedy called Service Deluxe, and he hated it. I mean, he hated it. And he spoke so disparagingly of that movie that I thought, oh my God, it must be terrible. And I remember the first time I saw it, and I thought, oh, it's just a typical 1930s screwball comedy. He was perfectly good. He was incredibly handsome. And that was really a testimony to how much he hated it. So he really wanted to be a character actor. The actors he admired were character actors: Spencer Tracy, Edward G. Robinson, Jimmy Cagney. And so he kept going back to the theater to really get to do acting.
Right.
He was in Orson Welles' Mercury Theater. And then after his contract with Universal expired, he actually went back to Broadway and did a melodrama. And the melodrama was called Angel Street, which later became the movie Gaslight with Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer.
Right.
And, it's a melodrama, like a hiss-boo melodrama. And my dad, there he was, this 6'4", handsome man, and driving his wife, crazy, making her feel like she's being gaslit. And he just felt how much the audience hated him. And he loved it. And he realized that that's how he could be a character actor, by being a villain.
Right.
And so that was really, he understood that he couldn't play against his own type. So he had to figure out how to make his type into a character actor. And that's why horror films were such a...
Well, he reveled in it.
Yeah, blessing. It's a weird word to use about horror, but they were a blessing.
He reveled in it. And he, he did reinvent himself during the 50s when so many actors were not in motion pictures and so forth and going into television, and House of Wax, and then he was in I just saw him at the TCM Film Festival. They showed a beautiful version of the Ten Commandments, and there he is cracking his whip and being a villain, how many thousand years ago. But I believe another thing he said when someone chided him about being in something kind of hokey like the Ten Commandments, he says, well, you're really not a motion picture actor unless you've been in a DeMille picture.
DeMille, he said everybody wanted. I mean, if you didn't get cast, it was a cast of literally thousands, and if you didn't get cast in that picture, who were you?
Right. I know one of his other interests was cooking. Did he pass that on, I guess, to you, or was that something you shared with your mom and the family?
My mother was the better cook originally, but my dad loved to eat, and they would travel the world, and they were really, I think, their common ground was they were collectors, not just of things, but of experiences. And so my dad loved to eat, and if he loved a recipe, he'd say to a chef, "Oh my God, that was fantastic," and the chef would give him the recipe. And they would come home, and my mother would have bought sort of design elements from different places, and they would recreate those experiences for their friends. And out of that, in 1965, came a cookbook, which was called A Treasury of Great Recipes, and it sold 350,000 copies when it came out. And it was iconic. Saveur magazine named it one of the 100 most important culinary events of the 20th century because it was this aspirational cookbook. It was beautiful. It had, menus and photographs and, in my dad's voice, descriptions of going all over the world eating at these places, all of which weren't fancy places. Like Palm Springs is actually in it. The Racket Club was in it. But Dodger Stadium is in it because nothing tastes better than
the Dodger dog.
Right?
Oh, God.
So, but then people would invite him on shows and ask him to cook, and he thought, I'm not going to go on a show and not know what I'm doing. So he became this exacting cook. Like, he would cook things over and over again till he got it right, which meant that, like, pretty much every day of my childhood we ate ratatouille. Which was, I can't even look at ratatouille anymore.
And I guess when you were coming up, that was when he was on the Hollywood Squares
Yeah,
all the time.
900 Hollywood Squares.
My God.
I like to say Hollywood Squares paid for my college education.
Yeah, I mean, aside from the financial thing, he looked like he enjoyed that as
Oh
well.
my, who wouldn't have had fun? It was
Yeah,
so much
he
fun.
and
it
Paul
was-
Lynn.
Yeah, no, it was great. And all these Joan Rivers, who became a great friend.
Right,
And it was
right.
a fun gig because you'd go, they'd film 5 in a day, 3 before lunch and 2 after lunch, and just
Uh-huh.
laugh all the way through it.
Right, right.
And they'd all go
right.
on vacation together.